this is something my wife has pointed out too. She said, well, men are going to have to stand up for themselves, but here's the problem. I know how to stand up to a man who's unfairly trespassing against me. And the reason I know that is because the parameters for my resistance are quite well defined, which is we talk, we argue, we push, and then it becomes physical, right? Like if we move beyond the boundaries of civil discourse, we know what the next step is. Okay, that's forbidden in discourse with women. Right. And so I don't think that men can control crazy women. I really don't believe it. I think that they have to throw their hands up in it's not even disbelief. It's that there's no step forward that you can take under those circumstances, because if the man is offensive enough and crazy enough, the reaction becomes physical right away, or at least the threat is there. And when men are talking to each other in any serious manner, that underlying threat of physicality is always there, especially if it's a real conversation, and it keeps the thing civilized to some degree. If you're talking to a man who wouldn't fight with you under any circumstances whatsoever, then you're talking to someone to whom you have absolutely no respect. But I can't see any way. For example, there's a woman in Toronto who's been organizing this movement, let's say, against me and some other people who are going to do a free speech event, and she managed to organize quite effectively, and she's quite offensive, you might say. She compared us to Nazis, for example, which, publicly, using the swastika, which wasn't really something I was all that fond of. But I'm defenseless against that kind of female insanity, because the techniques that I would use against a man who was employing those tactics are forbidden to me. So I don't know, it seems to me that it isn't men that have to stand up and say enough of this, even though that is what they should do. It seems to me that it's sane women who have to stand up against their crazy sisters and say, look, enough of that, enough man-hating, enough pathology, enough bringing disgrace on us as a gender. But the problem there, and then I'll stop my little tirade, is that most of the women I know who are sane are busy doing sane things, right? They're off, they have their career, they have their family, they're quite occupied, and they don't seem to have the time or maybe even the interest to go after their crazy harpy sisters. And so I don't see any regulating force for that terrible femininity.
So that was Jordan Peterson talking to Camille Paglia. This was a few months ago, and I want to expand upon some of the things he said, as well as address some of the things he said. Now, I don't want to talk too much about this one element of things, but I wouldn't necessarily disagree with Peterson on his assertion that the reason why you can have a discussion with a man is because there's an underlying threat of violence. But I would veer more towards the idea that men are more reasonable. They're more willing to listen to evidence. They're not as much ruled by emotion. And I think it says a lot about Jordan Peterson's character, this man who's always plumbing the depths of his own darkness, to make the suggestion that altercations, intellectual altercations between men, are primarily based upon the latent threat of violence. I really think he is going a bit too far here. Is that element there? Probably. But I think intellectual altercations between men are obviously about ego, oftentimes, but really about competing ideas. And as much as the people participating in the dispute, discussion, however you wish to term it, are interested in the evidence and emending their own viewpoints and their own theory, they will listen, and they're more reasonable. So that's one area where I think Peterson is perhaps partially right, but Peterson has this tendency to just take some relatively minor element or some element that might be there and just run with it to the outer depths of space, to the heavens, and turn it into an all-encompassing, overarching theory. What he's basically done here, in my opinion. Just finalize that point there. I think men on average are more willing and more capable of using their faculties of reason, listening to evidence, etc., etc. And I think there's another element to this as well regarding discussions disputes that changes the dynamic. It's not just the threat of violence. It's that we have to theorize a world in which, theoretically, every female a male is speaking to is a prospective receptacle of semen for the purposes of reproduction. Now, of course, at some point in time that becomes absurd, that claim. After all, it's very unlikely a man of any age would have a terribly deep sexual interest in a 65-year-old. But I think that element, the element of white knighting, which is basically what he's talking about. Peterson is saying, I'm a white knight, I can't deal with women because I can't punch them in the face like I could do a man. That's basically what he's saying. That's why, among other reasons, which I'll get into in a bit, why men have a lot of difficulty dealing with quote-unquote crazy women. And I don't think it's just crazy women, but more to come on that. So Peterson is taking these minor elements and really, as is typical for him, overlooking some of the larger themes here. Why do men treat women really well, eschew violence against them, don't want to argue harshly against them as a rule? Because of their potential as receptacles for sperm and therefore the propagation of DNA. That's reasonably simple. And from that, and being the limiting factor in reproduction, and et cetera, and from that, many things can be derived. I don't really think it's primarily about, I can punch a man in the face, but I can't do the same to a woman, and that's the end of the story. So Peterson has some really interesting reasoning sometimes, and I don't really follow it, and I think he's, in some cases, demonstrably wrong. Of course, yes, there is some latent threat of violence between men, but it's not the major driving force when one is engaged in an intellectual dispute with another man. Now, you could argue you're very rarely engaged in intellectual dispute with women for obvious reasons that the audience might grasp. But this other issue that I'd like to address is the issue of crazy women. It's not just crazy women, all right? Because he talks about this notion that women need to stand up to their sisters. Well, it is true women are natural collectivists, and they're collectivists towards themselves, and have an in-group preference that's not exhibited by men. But by and large, the female craziness on a macro scale does not, let me repeat that, by and large, the female craziness on a macro scale does not reduce the benefits women receive in society as individual women. Now, you might think, or posit, and you could posit that, but yes, their behavior has an impact on the perception of women, and it just ruins the whole game for women, and therefore women should have an inclination, at the very least, if not a responsibility, to correcting those types of behavior and trying to denounce those types of behavior. But at the end of the day, the actions and behaviors of crazy women have benefited women on the macro scale, in the sense that every woman participating in society benefits from it, and on the micro scale, in the sense that each individual woman benefits greatly from it. So the quote-unquote discontented wife who's bored at home and decides to have an affair with the pool boy or some other guy because her husband is off working too much, to her mind, paying the bills, she can just file for divorce on a whim. She doesn't care. I mean, maybe this is an example of Peterson's women who are just too busy to deal with them. And that actually, that phrase, too busy to deal with them, and I am paraphrasing here, tells you a lot about the story. The craziness of women, has largely been a story of women, crazy or otherwise, engaging in certain types of behavior that have had a negative impact, far less so for women and far more so for men, right? Now, I want you to envision a world in which the impact of crazy women's behavior actually had a direct line to your everyday woman, and this happened en masse, well, then perhaps you'd see a much greater response. You would see women perhaps trying to put down other women or put them in their place. But no, the fallout from all of this is usually with regards to men, and has very little to do with anything else. Because at the end of the day, we come back to that very simple formula of eggs are expensive, sperm are cheap, and from that, the entirety of the hierarchy of individual importance and collective importance in society can be derived. As the late man-woman myth once put it, men are human doings and women are human beings. And so women are not going to band together to deal with their crazy sisters, because there's no real direct benefit from that. They still have the benefit of the courts, they still have financial aid to study, they still have all of these wonderful things at their disposal. So who cares if a couple of quote-unquote crazy women do crazy things? And indeed, in the majority, it's not crazy women doing ruinous things, it's normal women doing ruinous things across the bounds of society, particularly in the case of the family courts and their behavior related thereto. Now, there's another element I'd like to talk about before I end this video, and that is the element of intersexual conflict. Not intrasexual conflict, because that's a reference to conflict within the sexes. So there's intrasexual conflict between men and intrasexual conflict between women, but intersexual conflict. Now, there are many people, particularly from traditional backgrounds, who would argue that intersexual conflict is simply mythology, that it doesn't exist, that it's part of feminist propaganda, that it's Marxism. These have been the seeds sown by sinister and shadowy powers to create a rift between men and women. Maybe that's true, but intersexual conflict nonetheless has existed and continues to exist. And there's a simple reason for this. The specific reproductive needs of men and women are very different, and they go about it in a different way. And even if you're going to argue from a complementary perspective, and many people do, they're complementarians, they say, well, men and women complement each other perfectly. Some of them go that far as to say that. Others will say the sexes basically complement each other. Complementarianism does not disallow for conflict. Indeed, if it is noted that the sexes are quote-unquote complementary to each other because they have different needs, different approaches, then it's only natural that it should follow that it is entirely possible that one side's needs, desires, requirements could be pushed so far away from a sense of equilibrium that things could get completely out of kilter and out of whack, and indeed that's what we have now. So even if you buy into the notion of men and women are perfectly complementary to each other, or partially or mostly, you still get intersexual conflict, because what benefits women is not necessarily what benefits men. What is a good example of this? Education. The vast majority of things these days are geared towards female kind in the schools, especially at the lower grades, the lower levels of education. Elementary school, junior high school, high school, and indeed even university at some level is geared towards women. There are far more women in university these days. And this is because men and women learn differently. Well, is that not a form of intersexual conflict? One side getting more of what benefits it as opposed to the other side? The same could be said for divorce. Men are much more willing to stick around and to stick through BS and deal with things they find unpleasant, whereas women are much more likely to bail. women are much less loyal in that sense. Loyal to a cause. Less loyal to a cause is a good way of putting it. Who does this benefit? Well, in theory, no-fault divorce benefits anyone, because, in theory, men could file for divorce 70% of the time, just like women do, but they don't, because men are different. So who does no-fault divorce really benefit? So the point I'm trying to illustrate here is that you can have intersexual conflict, even if you make the claim that men and women naturally complement each other, because of these different needs, desires, and indeed different outcomes. Things can get so far skewed to one side or the other, at least in theory, in the case of men, although not in practice, that you can get disastrous results, which is what we see when we look upon the ruined landscape of modernity and the relationship between the sexes. And frankly speaking, for all of the reasons that Peterson mentions in the beginning of this video, men are not going to be the ones to put women in their place, because that would require men to be mean to women. Or, as Peterson puts it, have that underlying threat of violence, right? Men are loath to even entertain violence against women. And in fact, I'm not endorsing violence against anyone. The point is quite simple, however, that men are the ones who enacted all of this, put it all into place at the behest of women, and they, in theory, would have to be the ones to remove it. But for the reasons I cited earlier, women are not going to want to do that. Not when the individual woman benefits on a micro scale, and on a macro scale, women overall are doing quite okay. Yes, women are less happy than they used to be, but they still have a lot more freedom than they used to have. More mobility. They get government aid. Everyone under the sun is trying to help them. Seems like a pretty good deal. Forget about the crazy harpies. I mean, these are quote-unquote minor examples. Why bother with them? So, once again, Peterson is just strangely focused on particulars and not looking at the bigger picture here. I have no doubt that Peterson's acolytes will criticize me for this, but the completely fucked up nature of the relationship between the sexes these days is integral to understanding the problems in society. The so-called WQ, the woman question, is one that needs to be answered. And it means asking some pretty hard questions about human nature, male nature, female nature, and it might take you down some dark rabbit hole you might not want to go, and certainly not in a public venue. Jordan Peterson. Anyway, that's all I have to say on that. More to come, hopefully, assuming I'm alive, and I will check you out later. May the gods be with you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.